Once every generation, there is that one game that pushes the boundaries of the medium on a technical and artistic level so far ahead that you kind of fall in love with gaming all over again, and after having played God of War, I think I might have found that game. If you just want the short version, then here it is. The game is a masterpiece. Do yourself a huge favor, set aside a weekend, and please play this game. This is one of those games that I was so completely immersed in that I literally lost track of time. The first day I got my review copy from Sony, I played the game for 12 hours straight. This was also one of those days where I hadn't gotten much sleep, so the fact that the game engrossed me enough to keep me awake for an additional 12 hours says a lot. But enough about my dysfunctional sleep schedule, let's talk about God of War and why this has become one of my favorite games of all time. The game picks up many years after the events of God of War 3. The second you boot up the game, you'll be greeted with a much older Kratos, who uprooted himself from his homeland of Greece and took shelter in Norway, hiding among the Norse gods. It is there that he's raising his son, Atreus, and the game opens with the funeral and cremation of the child's late mother. We very quickly learned that she had one last wish, that her ashes be scattered at the highest peak of the highest mountain, marking the beginning of a long, tumultuous, heartfelt father and son journey, all presented with an impressive one-shot cinematic format in which the camera never cuts once. I really don't want to say much more than that because spoiling even the smallest of story details would do God of War's emotional narrative experience disservice. But suffice to say that above all else, it's the father and son relationship that ties the whole experience together. I absolutely love this pair, both through their tender moments that bring them closer together and through the turbulent moments that test their relationship. On the one hand, you've got Kratos, who's very stern, he's all about strict discipline, and doesn't quite know how to connect with his son or express love in a way that more traditional fathers would. On the other hand, you've got Atreus, who recently lost his mother, who is very free-spirited, and is looking for any way to connect with the only family he's now got left. They are two very contrasting personalities that often clash, but also find ways to reconcile with each other throughout their entire journey, and it's moments where you see this dynamic gradually develop that God of War shines brightest. It may happen through some of the more bombastic scenes, or it could happen in fleeting instances like the numerous quips and conversations that the pair shares as you explore the world, but either way, it is fantastic. The theme of family runs deep, surely in part due to how game director Cory Barlog himself became a father shortly after the start of the game's development, which is perhaps why God of War so prominently wrestles with the question of what it is to be a parent, one that has no simple answer, and this is expressed genuinely from multiple perspectives, made all the more compelling with the added layer of the gods' mythos and the baggage, curse, and responsibility that comes with all that. The end result is that from a narrative perspective, the God of War series has matured in all the right ways, and for the first time, it tells a very relatable, character-driven story that will tug at your heartstrings and never let go. I especially love what they did with Kratos, who in past entries came across as a somewhat one-dimensional character whose defining attribute was basically shouting from the top of his lungs how he'll have his revenge before painting the floors and walls with crimson. But in this latest entry, Kratos actually feels three-dimensional, and we get to see his human side with all of its imperfections in a way that's never been explored before, elevating the character to a whole new level. This has in no small part to do with an incredible performance from Christopher Judge, who strikes just the right balance of being that hardened, downtrodden, rigid Kratos we're familiar with, while subtly letting his nurturing, fatherly side peek through when it needs to. And then there is Sonny Suljic, the incredibly talented child actor who plays Atreus, who masterfully expresses the character's adventurous spirit, his grief, his longing for love, and his frustrations. The rest of the cast is truly phenomenal as well, allowing the unique personalities of every character you meet to shine through. This is all aided by the game's utterly mind-blowing visuals and masterfully executed presentation. God of War may very well be the most beautiful video game I've ever laid eyes on, both from a technical and artistic standpoint, and I don't say that lightly. It's a perfect marriage of some of the most consistently realistic graphics I've ever seen, with detailed textures, high-quality object and character models, and flawless animation, along with some of the most beautiful imagery I've ever seen in any medium. Whether your attention is drawn to the minute details of Kratos' mighty beard, or to the jaw-dropping scenery that is God of War's amalgamation of fantastical Norse landscapes and architecture, there was seldom an instance where I wasn't tempted to just stop and slowly pan the camera around to bask in some sweet ocular candy. And the game's minimalistic hub does a smart job of tucking itself away when it's not needed, to allow players to fully bask in all the visual glory. The diversity of otherworldly environments was particularly impressive, with each realm that you visit offering its own distinct, colorful palette that astound in their own unique way. All of it is beautifully complemented by some impressive sound design, along with a soundtrack whose numerous renditions of the main melody will draw out a wide range of moods and emotions out of the myriad of pristinely directed cutscenes and sequences. I don't know how else to say this. God of War looks and sounds impossibly gorgeous from beginning to end. But none of that would matter if the game didn't play well, though fortunately, gameplay is nothing short of phenomenal. It is important to understand, however, that if you're going into this game expecting the same combat system from past entries, you're going to be disappointed. Combat and movement have been completely overhauled into something much more up close and personal, with a third-person over-the-shoulder camera replacing the old, dynamically shifting, all-encompassing one. Because your perspective is much more closely tied to Kratos now, you may find that while you're focused on the enemies in front of you, enemies out of view will catch you by surprise, though threat indicators help players prepare for incoming attacks. Furthermore, whereas combat in past God of War games often encouraged a very aggressive mindset, in the latest entry, combat requires you to be much more tactical, restrained, and deliberate with your approach. The best way I can describe it is that it's halfway between combat from games like Bloodborne and the old God of War entries. There are still elements of that fast-paced, aggressive brutality, but there are plenty of scenarios in which a more nuanced, patient approach is paramount to success. The game also tightens combat by focusing on just a handful of weapons and tools: the Leviathan axe, your fists and shield, and Atreus' bow and arrow, all of which are accessible from the outset. It reminds me a lot of Zelda Breath of the Wild's design, where instead of progressively giving you a wide variety of new items in a way that spreads their uses thin, it gives you all the handful of tools the game focuses on right from the start so that the rest of the experience can bring the most out of each one of them. Suffice to say that you'll get to know your axe, your fists and shield, and Atreus' bow and arrow quite intimately throughout your adventure. The axe in particular is a uniquely cool weapon with how you can throw it and recall it to your liking with devastating effects. This paves the way for some fun experimentation. You might throw the axe at an enemy who is further away, engage in fisticuffs with the one nearby, then reposition yourself so that your current adversary is sandwiched between you and the axe, and then recall the axe to hit any obstacles on its way back before resuming your flurry of blows. Moments like these are made all the more satisfying by the incredible sense of impact permeating from every blow you deliver, especially when Kratos goes into rage mode and starts mercilessly pummeling away at anything in his path. Hell, I found that the satisfying thump that emanates when the axe flies back into your hands alone was reason enough to discard it as often as possible. Another factor to consider in battle is how axes do more raw damage that will straight up kill your enemies, while fist and shield do more stun damage that will eventually allow you to execute special finisher moves, each of which play important roles depending on who you're fighting. I'm not gonna lie to you, it can all be pretty overwhelming, especially starting out. It doesn't take long for the game to start throwing at you encounters that mix up a wide variety of enemy types, each with their own attack patterns, weaknesses, and ideal method of approach, so you'll find yourself doing a lot of mental juggling while the game demands that you maintain your composure, remember your movesets, and maintain spatial awareness due to the more limited view of the up-close third-person camera. But once you get the hang of it, there is immense satisfaction out of just decimating your foes with intuitive sequences of attacks and dodges that flow from one weapon to another and chain together seamlessly into visceral combos. After struggling for a bit, I found myself becoming quite addicted to the flexibility that this more focused, personal, visceral combat system offers. I must warn you though, even after you get the hang of combat, expect to die a lot. There are some really tough fights in this game, requiring a lot of trial and error, learning your foe's attack patterns, being patient with your offense and defense, so on and so forth. Rushing in, mashing buttons will get you absolutely nowhere with these confrontations. Hell, some of the more optional enemies and mini-boss fights are so tough that you'll get one-hit KO'd if Kratos hasn't been upgraded to a certain level via the game's surprisingly in-depth progression system, through which players can learn new skills, earn upgrades, and boost stats. Each one of Kratos' weapons, so things like the axe, the fists and shield, and Atreus' bow and arrow, have their own skill trees that grant new movesets and further expand your mobility and offensive capabilities, while armor grants statistical boosts to enhance damage, defense, cooldown speeds, etc. For armor, you can give Kratos arm, waist, and chest armor pieces, as well as a talisman, all of which serve to enhance stats, and the armor pieces in particular will also have a number of enchantment slots to insert gems found throughout the world that grant additional stat boosts, and even new passive and/or active abilities. Atreus himself can also be equipped with different armor sets that boost his abilities or grant him new skills to more effectively aid you in battle. As far as weapons go, primary forms of offense like Kratos' Leviathan Axe can be equipped with different pommels that may also grant stat boosts, passive abilities, and/or active abilities. Furthermore, primary weapons can be slotted with runes that give Kratos special moves called runic attacks. There's a slot to equip one light runic attack and one heavy runic attack. There's a decent selection of both light and heavy runic attacks to choose from and switch in and out at your leisure, all found throughout the game world, each of which do very different things. So in my case, I set my light runic attack to be a whirlwind spinning attack, and my heavy runic attack to be a devastating continuous pummeling of the axe. As if all that wasn't enough, each of these components, the various weapons, the pommels, the armor pieces, the talisman, the runes, can all be upgraded through the blacksmith to further increase stats or enhance passive and active abilities, though doing so does require that you find crafting materials scattered throughout the game world. Now, when I say game world, I'm talking about a surprisingly expansive open world, which may come as a surprise to God of War veterans who may be used to the more traditional linear structure. While we're not talking about Breath of the Wild scale of open world where you can scale any mountain in sight, there is a large, central, densely packed open hub that continuously expands in scope as you progress through the main campaign, from which the game branches out to other open areas that you can go to and from, whether they be giant set pieces for the main quest, smaller landmarks for the game's various side quests and mini encounters, or bite-sized dungeons where you might encounter some enemies, solve some puzzles, and find treasure with rewards like crafting materials, money, collectibles, or items that increase maximum health or rage meter. After a while, the side tasks did start to get somewhat repetitive and feel like padding, often involving minor variations of familiar battles and puzzles, but at the same time, the anticipation for new locales and vistas to see, new lore to discover, new dialogue and banter to listen to, and additional character progression to look forward to were enough to keep me engaged whenever I strayed off the beaten path. There are also some side quests that are surprisingly large in scale with some really cool set pieces, so they're definitely worth seeking out. If you aren't into exploring every nook and cranny of an open world and don't mind missing out on some rewards though, you can always just beeline straight through the main campaign, which is where the meat of the game lies, and by the gods, is it a magnificent campaign. Throughout your 35 hours journey or so, you'll be exploring large-scale, open environments across multiple distinct realms, solving some cleverly implemented, albeit repetitive, environmental puzzles, fighting all manners of creatures from Norse mythology, engaging in some truly spectacular boss battles, and bearing witness to some of the most awe-inspiring set pieces and sequences I have ever seen. There are so many moments in this game that I really just don't want to spoil in any way whatsoever, as they are definitely best experienced with fresh eyes, but this is a roller coaster ride like no other. If I have to nitpick, I do wish that there were more of the monumental boss battles in the game. The ones that are there are pure adrenaline and bliss, but I did feel as though there were too few and far between. It is clear, however, that the story is far from over, so encounters are only bound to get bigger and more ambitious with future entries in the series. Now, throughout the trek that is God of War's main campaign, Atreus will be by your side, non-intrusively aiding in combat, helping overcome obstacles, noting points of interest, translating Norse text, imagery, and lore, and nudging players in the right direction. Mechanically speaking, Atreus gets a whole button to himself, square, and it's what you'll press whenever you issue a command to him, both in and outside of combat. It's always a risky move to create a game where you're always accompanied by an AI companion, but in the case of Atreus, he never feels like he gets in the way and feels pretty integral to both the overall narrative and gameplay design. He's easily one of the best implemented AI companions in a video game, with players given just enough control over him to make him useful, not to mention that he's just an all-around fantastic character who beautifully complements Kratos, much like how every facet of this game complement each other to form a masterfully realized package. God of War is excellence in its purest form, with attention and love poured onto every facet, whether it's the presentation or the gameplay. All of it done with zero caveats or compromises, no microtransactions whatsoever found anywhere here. Despite the fact that you can see that they could have easily found a way to implement that somehow, they decided to just completely forego monetization schemes that compromise the experience. Furthermore, elements you think wouldn't work in this series, like a surprisingly dense open world or an unexpectedly deep player-driven progression system, make for a welcome addition. But at the end of the day, what is art if it isn't a means for sincere expression, a means to bring out powerful emotions, sentiments, thoughts, and feelings within people? On that front, God of War is true art, a true masterpiece at that, in my eyes at least, and it may very well define an entire generation of games, though that could change with so many other fantastic games on the horizon, especially from Sony. But for now, God of War is looking like a pretty damn good candidate for Game of the Year, and it deserves its place in my list of top 5 games of all time. So yeah, to make a long story short, buy this game. Show Cory Barlog and his team over at Santa Monica Studios some love, because gods know that they deserve it. With that, I would like to conclude my review of God of War. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoy my content, consider supporting me on Patreon. It is completely optional, but donating even as little as $1 a month will go a long way in helping maintain this channel. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Yong Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Yong out.